Hello everyone, my name's David Ridley and this talk is called The Rising Tide That Lifts All Boats, the Myth of the Invisible Hand and the Fetish of Competition in UK Higher Education Reform. My email address is at the bottom of this slide here, so if anyone's got any questions or would like to discuss anything that I've said further, then please do email me. Now, I've included a kind of picture round just to add a more kind of humorous element to this talk, so feel free to shout out these characters as they appear if you recognise them. The first one is, hopefully you'll recognise, is David Willetts, and the title of the talk comes from this speech that he gave to Vice-Chancellors in 2011, and it points to the meaning of the rising tide that lifts all boats, where the higher education system in the UK needs to be reformed, and the way to reform this is to let new providers into the system, by which it is meant allowing for profit and exclusively private higher education institutions, HEIs, into the system, and that this reform will improve higher education. But as Willetts points out, there's a barrier to this, which is the fact that some higher education institutions, or the majority, are publicly funded, and this warps the market, as it were, and stops new providers being able to compete. But the question remains, why do we need to reform the system? And so before I analyse this deeper question, I'm going to go back to the beginning of these reforms and go through the kind of history. But ultimately I'll argue that the reforms are driven by a deeper belief in the myth of the invisible hand, which is pointed to by the rising tide that lifts all boats, that Willetts said in his speech, and that this belief is a symptom of neoliberalism, or in essence is the core of neoliberalism. Well, I'll argue that later. But first, I think it's useful to go back to the beginning of the reforms to understand on their own terms why they were introduced. And the Deering report, all the way back in 1997, is crucial text, and effectively the point is that what was developing into a mass system of higher education wasn't affordable in the old way of funding it, and so free tuition is unaffordable in the mass system of higher education which we now have, and the report quotes numbers rising from 5% in the early 1960s up to 30% in the mid-90s, and further now I think up to somewhere like 50% that we have today. And so three specific economic problems pointed out by the Deering report are that universities were poor, students were poor, and that top-up loans were not really appropriate, and that they were mortgage style rather than income contingent, which is what we have today. But the main reason why the loan system wasn't switched to income contingent as it is today was that they were still classified. They would still be classified as public expenditure by the accountancy system of the government. And I'm not going to go into this in too much detail now, but if you read Andrew McGettigan's book, The Great University Gamble, he explains this difference. But effectively now they're not classed as public expenditure, which is why this was taken up as a way to reduce the deficit in the current austerity discourse. But as I say, it's worth looking at this, but I'm not going to look at it right now. And then New Labour are the ones who introduce tuition fees in 1998 when they come to power, and starting at £1,000, but then in their second, when they're re-elected, this increases to £3,000. Now, ironically, this was very unpopular with the Tories back then, and Ian Duncan Smith claimed that the fees were a tax on learning. because of this unpopularity in Parliament, one concession which Labour made to get these reforms through was a full review of the higher education situation. And this review was undertaken by Lord Brown, and it became what now everyone knows as the Brown Report. And this Brown Report recommended basically the whole reform according to the market and how this would work, and a reasonably self-sufficient kind of set of policies, including removal of tuition fee caps, no caps on student numbers, removing funding for non-priority subjects, and the creation of a kind of super quango to regulate the whole thing, which effectively is HEFKI. And here he is, Lord Brown. And what's interesting about this quote is it's more explicit on the role of competition in the reforms, which is implied by Willits's rising tide that lifts all boats. But what needs to be reformed is the way that the way that the system works as a whole. Basically, competition needs to be introduced into higher education, and also then the students as consumers will need to be given an informed choice. So they need accurate and good information about the various universities and where to go, and then this whole thing needs to be regulated. But basically this, I would argue, points to the same kind of belief that competition in itself generally raises quality. And then with the coalition you get the absorption of these reforms into the general austerity agenda, but they basically pick and mix parts of the Brown Review to suit this agenda, as well as having to concede certain things to Liberals who made promises. And you can see with this quote in the White Paper of 2011, we were given the Brown Report in an environment when public funding had to be reduced, and so basically the funding of higher education would need to be placed on the people that are going to benefit from it, i.e. The students. But now, after 3 years or so of the coalition reforms and generally the reforms over this longer period, we can ask the question of how successful these reforms have been so far. And I would argue they haven't been very successful. They've arguably been a complete failure. And I've argued elsewhere, and it's in the references, but I've done a kind of critical summary of this situation. On the one question of whether we've reduced public spending, the gamble was, this is in reference to McGettigan's book, that even after 30% of loans are written off after 30 years, the government would still save £1 billion, and this goes back to the kind of accountancy changes that I referred to earlier. But recent estimations have revised this figure to about 45%, so now the government think that 45% of loans will be written off for various reasons, and this all but nullifies any savings to the public purse. And then London Economics have predicted that if this exceeds 48.6%, which is only 3.6% more, and it's already jumped 15%, so it's quite likely, then the cost of the reforms will exceed the cost of the system it replaced, even by the coalition accountancy system. So, no, we haven't reduced public spending. And secondly, will the market reforms increase quality? So this is the other kind of promise. But even though these reforms haven't been introduced wholesale, in those alternative providers, that are usually part of a recognised institution as a kind of subsidiary, there is a 20% dropout rate. This is just published a couple of weeks ago by the National Audit Office during 2012 and 2013. This is, in comparison to publicly funded institutions, quite high, and there's only a 4% dropout rate. And also we have quite a lot of information from the US. In America, in 2012, Senator Tom Harkin published an in-depth report after a 2-year research project, and it was a case study of 30 US for-profit higher education institutions. And there he found that there was a 64% average dropout rate, and the money that was spent on instruction was relatively low, only 17.7% compared to 22.4% on marketing and advertising, and then 19.4% on profit distributions, which are basically what money is then funneled out of the higher education institution to shareholders and other profit-seeking parts of these institutions. So actually more money is extracted than is spent on the actual teaching. So as you can see, the reforms aren't looking particularly successful or desirable, but we are still carrying on with them, and the question then remains why. So even though the evidence is starting to become overwhelming that this is not a good idea, the coalition and probably the next government will carry on with this, and why? And I think we can turn to the concept of neoliberalism, where this is part of a grander and bigger agenda. But I think the concept of neoliberalism is somewhat problematic, and this is what I'll look at for the remaining part of this talk. An example of the way that this concept is used, you can see in someone like Henry Giroux, and just from one paragraph, neoliberalism is described as something that assaults all things public. It's basically an aspect of market fundamentalism, and also takes away really any way of talking about these things in a public way. And so it's quite extreme, and I would argue that it's kind of apocalyptic in Giroux's use, and in a lot of uses where it's so powerful, this process and this ideology and whatever, that it undermines any action. And I think you feel just like there's no point doing anything because it's just so big and so powerful that you may as well just get on with your job and not bother. And so I think that undermines action. And also, in a similar way, it functions like a conspiracy theory. It overly simplifies things, making sense of an otherwise confusing mess, which is empowering, but I think only on a psychological level, on a subjective level. I don't think it really inspires collective action. I think it makes people feel like they're in the know, and other people are just part of this brainwashed herd, and I think that's not very helpful either. And also there's an interesting part, I've had some arguments with people about the use of this term, where yes, it's a useful way to agree with other people who are critical of what we call neoliberalism. However, it's not, as I've said here, no self-respecting neoliberal, whoever these people are, refer to themselves in this way. And so it kind of increasingly functions as a rhetorical device. And also there's an interesting paper by Boas and Gantz-Morse who really analyse the uses of the concept in various academic publications, and they say that it has acquired this negative normative valence, which basically means it only refers to the bad ideas held by others. It's not something that anyone subscribes to. And furthermore, the term is often undefined and employed everywhere in relation to everything that people disagree with. And Foucault, who we'll be talking about in the next few slides, would call this an example of inflationary critique, which he is talking about from the other side, where neoliberals would say any kind of market intervention into the market creates monopolies and totalitarianism, fascism. This works the other way with the concept of neoliberalism. It's this general disqualification by the worst, and most of the time it doesn't really help you understand reality in a kind of real way, and policy especially. And so I'm going to try to examine this concept and extract a kind of better meaning. But another example, this is Adam Smith. I've taken from Wikipedia as a kind of representative of an average understanding, where neoliberalism is associated with a re-emergence of laissez-faire, and laissez-faire is just this idea that the market should be left alone, and in extreme cases it means that you don't really need government because the market will take care of everything. But also neoliberalism also refers to economic liberalisation, free trade, and reductions in government spending. So the question there is neoliberalism just a return to classical liberalism and this laissez-faire ideal? And the answer is no, but to a certain extent it's yes and no. Partly, but partly not. But I think this is an overly simplistic and not very helpful idea, because it is and it isn't. And I think it's useful to go back to Foucault's 1979 lectures on neoliberalism, which has been published now in English translation as The Birth of Biopolitics. And this was only published a few years ago. But I still think that Foucault's account is a very useful history of neoliberalism, or genealogy as he would call it. But I think what's useful about Foucault is that he really does take this neoliberal theory on its own terms as a substantive kind of social, philosophical, political theory. This is part of the problem of the concept of neoliberalism, is it's not based on this full understanding of what it represents. It's more dismissive. So I think it's a good place to go. And for Foucault, liberalism is fundamentally a form of critical reason. And we can see this associated with the Enlightenment and people like Kant. And basically what that means is, historically, liberalism was a critique of the repressive, as Foucault calls, police state kind of authoritarian government that came before, that feudal society that came before capitalism in feudal society. And so initially, you've got the rise of the bourgeoisie and the capitalist interests, and this liberalism is a kind of philosophical critique that informs this general movement. However, in post-World War II Germany, there arises a need for a European post-fascist capitalist or liberal capitalist state, and so the question becomes not how to get rid of a previous form of government, but how to form a new, as Foucault would say, governmentality based on liberalism. And so this transforms the critical, negative part of liberalism into a kind of positive plan, and this is the task of German neoliberalism, or ordoliberalism, but I think they called themselves neoliberals. And basically what happens is an outline of a kind of liberal social policy. And already you can see how this moves away from this simplistic idea of neoliberalism as a return to laissez-faire, because there is no social policy in laissez-faire as classically understood. And so, yes, in principle, neoliberals in Germany agree that there should be no economic intervention by government, and as part of a general critique of the Keynesianism that was happening a lot at the time, this is seen as leading to the concentration camps, which is an example of inflationary critique already mentioned. So all economic intervention leads to monopolies, fascism, communism, etc. However, the difference with ordoliberals, with classical economists, is that they believe that that the market, the essence of the market, isn't this free exchange between equal partners. It's competition, and that this requires inequality, between people, but also that this competition isn't natural. This is something that must be created, and this is something that the government can do in a liberal state. Social policy creating competition, and also monopolies are created by state intervention in the economy and are not a natural consequence of the market, like some critics of capitalism at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century argued. And so the role of government is to prevent monopolies and also to create the conditions of the market. And this is just a useful quote from Wilhelm Röpke, one of the Ordo liberals. The market requires an active and extremely vigilant policy. So you can see that instead of a lack of interference in general, what you have is a distinction between the economic and the social, and that the government should act in the social but not in the economic. And I think this helps with certain confusions that you get with neoliberalism when it's thought of as a return to laissez-faire. Some people, get confused at the kind of excessive government that you see. An example is the philosopher John Gray. And basically they see that the state is becoming more active and involved in social life, and this is a contradiction. They're privatising, actively involved in putting forward privatising policies, bailing out banks, still committed to a minimal welfare, although within an ideology of scroungers, etc. But you can see that this makes perfect sense on the back of this history of neoliberalism. And here he is. And this is a nice quote from Foucault, I think. According to the Ordo liberals, competition is an essential economic logic that will only appear and produce its effects under certain conditions which have to be carefully and artificially constructed. And so going back to the title of a previous slide, effectively what you see with neoliberalism in Germany is this idea that the market needs to be socially constructed and that it isn't a natural phenomenon. But interestingly, at the end of Foucault's lectures, he returns to Adam Smith and the idea of the invisible hand. And although, some people see that Foucault's a historian of discontinuity, I think he ends up finding this continuity, and basically it's in this belief in this invisible hand. And what I think, interpreting Foucault in a way that he probably wouldn't really approve of, as well as this myth of the invisible hand that runs through neoliberalism, I think what you get is the formation of a rationality, a kind of liberal, neoliberal rationality, a positive theory of society. And so here you've got this hidden hand epistemology where, and this is explicit in Smith and the early classical liberalist economists, that no agent, whether that's individual or government, can know the market as a whole. Basically, the whole market, the logic of the entire thing can't be understood. It's kind of Kantian in the fact that the thing in itself is beyond human comprehension. Therefore, rationality is only self-interest. The only rational action is selfish action. But this is backed up by this myth of the invisible hand, which is unintended secondary benefits of self-interest. So somehow, and this is something I don't understand that well, but I don't think it's that clear, somehow this self-interest manages to benefit all, and you still get this in this trickle-down idea. And this has been discredited, by a lot of kind of contemporary economists like Joseph Stiglitz. And so basically what I'm arguing is that what you get with this positive liberalism that began with the Ordo liberals is a kind of outline of a neoliberal social theory. And so epistemologically, self-interest is the limit of human rationality. And also there's this ontology where all that exists are units of enterprise. So there's a vision of society where there are these atoms of enterprise, which could be individuals or corporations, companies or firms, and that they should all act in self-interest, and that the relationship between them is competition. But this competition is an ideal social relation, that it is the responsibility of government to create. And so on the one hand, government must respect the market, not interfere economically, but also make sure that competition is the sole relation, and that this, therefore, there are no monopolies created by government or anyone else. And then I think with human capital theory, you get the consolidation of this outline into a positive neoliberal social theory. And I think, the best example of this is in Gary Becker, where basically this social theory, as Foucault says, is like a grid of intelligibility where, any social phenomena can be explained economically. It's the application of economic, cost-benefit, supply-demand, efficiency type analyses to anything. And Becker, applied this to crime. There's a great description of this in Foucault, and also there are human capital theorists who have reinterpreted Max Weber's Protestant ethic thesis in terms of human capital theory, where it wasn't this value system that arose with Protestantism that allowed capitalism to flourish. It was actually the fact that people were reading more, the Bible was being translated into ordinary language, and people were educating themselves, and it was this investment in the self that led to, the success of capitalism, basically, which is interesting. But also, human capital theory then becomes able to cope with certain problems that arise from Marxist critiques of capitalism, like how value is created out of labour, how the falling rate of profit is solved, and also, how should welfare work in a capitalist society. Now, going back to Foucault's earlier point about liberalism being critique, it still is a critique, but it's a kind of, as Foucault says, a permanent tribunal on everything that the government does. So there's a theory of government that arises with this positive liberalism, but then also this kind of market superego that is constantly, well, it's actually, the government or the public sphere critiquing itself in terms of this market ideal. And so it's still critique, but effectively, the government critiques itself based on its own ideal social theory. And you can see this with higher education, where the reforms effectively come out of this critique, where they create monopoly. The public funding creates monopolies. It's it's becoming not the most efficient way of distributing scarce resources, and it's also preventing people from being enterprises, students, universities from being enterprises, and there's no competition. So, in terms of how we can use neoliberalism in a more successful way, I would argue that neoliberalism does function as an ideal type that we find in sociology, in Weber, for example, in that it's, we bring out the characteristic, typical, distinctive elements which are stressed or exaggerated, and that this is an ideal concept. So it's not something that you'll see exactly in real life, because it's more there to illuminate real life. So it's a bit like human capital theory functions in the same way. But the point is, I think that neoliberalism's always has functioned as an ideal type. It just didn't have it didn't really take the theory itself seriously as Foucault does. So I think Foucault allows us to build a better ideal type, which is more useful. But if it becomes not useful, it needs to be revised based on further analysis and really taking seriously neoliberal theory as it is. But I also think that neoliberalism functions as a worldview. It's an idea that you get from 19th century German social philosophy, but especially with Wilhelm Dilthey, where this is a deeper belief system. I think this is what I'm trying to say with this social theory of neoliberalism and this development of a positive social theory that I get from Foucault is, I don't think it matters if these are untrue. It's something more intuitive and something that informs a whole, way of seeing economic and social phenomena that you get on with people that kind of buy into this neoliberal worldview. And I don't think it's explicit. I think it's implicit, which is why you need to analyse, the theory of neoliberalism in order to extract this implicit worldview, which you can then construct as an ideal type. And so, to return to the question I posed earlier, why markets? Why markets even though the reforms aren't working? Well, it's because there's this deep belief in this implicit worldview of the invisible hand and the social theory that goes with it. And so the state cannot know the best way to distribute the scarce resource of higher education. So you've got this increasing demand, and this public funding method is just not functioning to distribute this good effectively. But this is because it's impossible for the state to know. Therefore, the state should not interfere. It's the state interference that has created monopolies, or perhaps more accurately, it's created these, privileges and elite. It hasn't created an even ground for everyone to be enterprising units in or something. And also, students and higher education institutions are enterprises, or they should be, but they're not being allowed to be within the current system. And so introducing a market will allow students and universities who are enterprises but aren't being allowed to be enterprises at the moment, will be able to decide based on self-interest and cost-benefit analysis what to do. And that the myth there in the background will then function. And interestingly, this myth is a kind of never proven thing, where it's always in the future. And if only there would be no interference. If this pure idea of the market with its social theory, if this entire system were put into place purely, then we would see this secondary benefits work perfectly. So basically, neoliberal theory is always saying, well, you can't see this because of this interference and it's not working properly, etc. Anyway, so the only rational solution, according to this neoliberal social theory, is to create a market in higher education. And so that's it really, but I think there's a couple of interesting issues that come out of this which need to be looked at further. One of them is going back to this idea that this is a worldview. If we can't just speak the truth to reforms or neoliberal, people that buy into this neoliberal worldview, like the Coalition and arguably Labour do as well, what should we do? I mean, basically we could write critiques with loads of evidence laying out exactly how this isn't going to work, even on an economic level, but this would not change anything. And basically what this means is, going back to this point about neoliberalism being something that we talk about but that neoliberals don't, it seems like we're only always talking to people that already agree with us. How do we talk to people that believe in this worldview if they're not going to listen to the facts, if you know what I mean? And then furthermore, what's the role of a public intellectual then? And secondly, if we kind of are maybe overly sympathetic to the reforms, we have to address the problem that public well, that mass higher education needs to be funded somehow, and this is where the UK reforms came from. This problem that we apparently couldn't afford it, or it was going to cost a lot of money, and where is this money going to come from? And so I think in order to address the deeper worldview, we need to, on the one hand, have an alternative vision of society and a different explanation of what individuals are and how they interact with each other, but also on the basis of that, how do we govern? So Foucault has this interesting point in The Birth of Biopolitics about how Marxism effectively never came up with their own art of government or governmentality, and this is what's missing from left critiques of neoliberalism. We haven't got an alternative idea or suggestions for the art of governing for an alternative social theory. So I think we're missing a consensus on what society is, and then how do we govern for that society. And related to this is higher education a public good? What is a public good? Has it ever been a public good? Should it be a public good? And then how do we govern for this? And the point is, I don't think we can go backwards. I don't think higher education has ever been a public good. I think it was maybe developing into one, but we've never had a mass public higher education system that was sustainable, I think. And that's the end. So thank you very much for listening. If you got this far, these are my references. And as I said, please do email if you've got any questions or you want to talk about anything further. Thank you very much.